本日は責任投資原則 PRI レポートから考える日本のバイオマス発電の課題、エネルギー利用から自然に基づく気候ソリューションへにご参加いただきありがとうございます。本日司会を務めます地球人間環境フォーラムの飯沼小夜子と申します。よろしくお願いします。最初にこのウェビナーでは日英の同時通訳が入りますので、画面の下の地球儀のアイコンがあると思うんですけれども、そこから、お聞きになりたい言語を選んでお聞きください。はい、では始めたいと思います。はい。ウェビナー責任投資原則 PRI レポートから考える日本のバイオマス発電の課題、エネルギー利用から自然に基づく気候ソリューションへです。はい。2012年に再生可能エネルギーを電力消費者の賦課金により支援するというフィット制度が始まってからすでに13年が経ちました。私たち地球人間環境フォーラムでは、本日の協力団体であるバイオマス産業社会ネットワークやウータン森と生活を考える会、マイティアースなどとともに、輸入燃料によるバイオマス発電の課題に取り組んできました。本日は昨年12月に発表された PRI のポリシーレポート、EU のバイオマスエネルギー政策と投資の気候自然リスクへの対応の著者であり、責任投資原則 PRI で EU の気候、自然、経済移行政策を、担当されている専門家であるマーティン・スティーブン、ごめんなさい、スティーブン・ヘン、ごめんなさい、スティーブン・ヘンゲ氏にお話しいただきます。このレポートでは、生きたバイオマスの自然の状態、つまり伐採されていない森林そのものが有する炭素蓄積や生物多様性の価値も含めたカスケード利用を提唱しています。気候変動対策として一刻も早い脱炭素が求められる中で、森林から直接伐採された木材をエネルギー利用することへの財政的支援の停止や、燃焼時や森林の炭素蓄積の損失による、温室効果ガス排出の評価といった提言をした点、さらに森林の炭素としての価値だけでなく、多様な価値、包括的な価値に着目しているという点も、大変本質的かつ画期的なレポートとなっていると思います。本日は最初に、日本の木質バイオマス発電の現状というタイトルで、地球人間環境フォーラムの鈴島克弘より短く導入のお話をさせていただきます。その後、マーティン・スティーブン・ヘンゲさんより、EU のバイオエネルギー政策と投資の気候自然リスクへの対応と題してお話しいただきます。質疑は最後にまとめてお受けしますので、画面下の Q&A のアイコンのところからご記入ください。では、鈴島さん、準備はよろしいでしょうか。よろしくお願いします。
はい。ではですね、まず私の方から最初に、我々の、普段の、バイオマス発電に関する活動ですね、日本のフィット制度に関する、問題意識等を、お話ししつつ、本日の後ほどのマーティンさんのプレゼンでですね、どういった点に注目しながら聞いて考えていただきたいのかということをですね、最初に、お話しさせていただければと思います。はい。はい、まずですね、この日本におけるバイオマス発電というものは、再生可能エネルギー固定価格買取制度という名前の制度でですね、推進されてきました。フィット制度とはですね、電力会社が、再エネを、市場価格より高い価格で一定期間、買い取ることをですね、義務付ける制度です。で、買い取りの原資として、このフィット再エネ賦課金というものがですね、 電気料金に上乗せする形で消費者から徴収されています。で、このフィット制度はですね、経済産業省の所管で、ありまして、環境社会面での適切で安全な発電所の開発を確保するために、事業計画策定ガイドラインというものがですね、策定されておりまして、このフィット認定を受けるためには、このガイドラインの遵守が前提とされているというところで、我々はこの経済産業省の担当部署、あるいは環境エネルギー関連のですね、議員さんへの政策提言活動なんかを行っております。はい。で、本日ですね、我々の活動の主眼は、このバイオマス発電、特に燃料を輸入し、大型のものがですね、本当に再エネとして適切なのかということをですね、問いかけたいと思います。で、再エネのメリットとしてはですね、これはフィット制度の、法律の目的として書かれていることでもあるんですけども、以下の点が挙げられます。一つがですね、環境負荷の低減、すなわち温室効果ガスの削減です。で、次にですね、エネルギーの安定供給の確保。三つ目が国際協力の強化、国内産業の振興、そして地域の活性化です。で、バイオマス発電、特に輸入大型のものがですね、これらの目的に合致するのかということがですね、大きな問いです。で、この日本のフィットバイオマス発電で使われている燃料を実際に見てみますと、国産間伐材、臨地残材等のですね、未利用木質というのは、全体の認定容量の1割程度でして、実はこの7割をですね、占めているのが一般木材、農産物残渣という輸入バイオマスです。で、この輸入バイオマスについてはですね、大きく2つありまして、海外からの木質ペレット、木材を砕いて圧縮したものと、パームヤシ殻というですね、アブラヤシの実から種を絞り取った後の、種の殻ですね、があります。で、このうちですね、森林との関係で木質ペレットについて見てみますと、木質ペレットの輸入量は、フィット制度が始まった、2012年から昨年2024年までの間に約88倍に増加しています。で、2024年はですね、輸入元第1位がベトナム、2位がカナダ、3位がアメリカ、で、その他にマレーシア、インドネシアというふうに来ています。で、バイオマス発電はですね、他の再エネと異なり、火力発電でありまして、燃料を必要としています。で、この木質バイオマス発電の場合、発電コストの7割が燃料費と言われておりまして、発電のみの場合ですね、エネルギー効率は大変低く、約20%から30%と言われています。つまりですね、コストはかかるのに、少ししか電気を作れないということで、純粋なビジネスとしてはですね、成立しないものなんですけれども、フィットの高い買取価格によって成立したということで、それによってですね、大型かつ輸入燃料に依存する発電所が急増しました。で、この燃料輸入費2024年度のものを見てみますと、木質ペレットと PKS 合わせて3000億円以上でして、これはですね、林野庁の当初予算に匹敵する額でして、つまりですね、これだけの額が、国内の林業振興、地域振興に回ることなく海外に流出していると。つまり国内産業の振興、地域の活性化にはですね、寄与しているとは言い難い状況になっています。はい。で、木質バイオマスのエネルギー効率はですね、20から30%でして、つまりですね、丸太を10本投入しても、電気になるのは3本だけで、残り7本分はですね、排熱になるということです。で、この熱をですね、きちんと利用すれば、効率は60%以上にできるんですけれども、写真にありますように、燃料を輸入している大規模な発電所でですね、熱を必要とする施設が近くになく、膨大に発生する熱をですね、その場で捨てているというのが現状です。で、このフィットバイオマスではですね、熱電並給、つまり熱を作って、電気も使うという、それがですね、認定の要件になっておらず、優遇もされていないというような状況でして、地域材、国産材を使うですね、中小規模の、バイオマス発電であっても、熱をですね、きちんと利用できておらず、エネルギー効率が低いといったのがですね、かなり傾向としてあります。はい。で、フィットの課題をですね、これからちょっと、数点絞ってお話ししたいんですけれども、この燃焼時のですね、CO2 排出について見てみますと、これは科学的な事実としまして、木質バイオマスの燃焼はですね、 燃焼による CO2 排出は石炭よりも多いということが分かっておりまして、これをですね、フィット・フィップ制度ではゼロカウントというふうにしています。で、木質バイオマスのエネルギー効率は低いと申しましたが、その低さをですね、考慮しますと、石炭火力発電の2倍近く、天然ガス発電の4倍にもなります。で、これはですね、当然ながら IEA、国際エネルギー機関のネットゼロシナリオによって示されているですね、発電セクターの CO2 排出量をですね、大きく上回っています。で、この GHG 排出量基準については、経産省の方でもですね、事業計画策定ガイドラインというものの中で基準が設けられまして、この2022年に設けられたんですけども、それによるとですね、2029年度までは、化石燃料費50%削減。で、2030年度以降は70%削減を求めています。で、この基準でもですね、バイオマスの燃焼による CO2 排出量を含んでいないというのがですね、大きな問題であります。で、またですね、輸入バイオマス、木質バイオマスの生産地でもですね、多くの環境社会、課題を抱えています。社会問題で言うとですね、先週もアメリカの関係者をお呼びしてセミナーを開催したんですけども、環境法令違反、大気汚染基準違反などがですね、たくさん報告されています。で、またですね、森林、生物多様性の面ではですね、特に日本向けの、ペレット生産と関連した、原生林や天然林の伐採というのがですね、カナダとかで、あとインドネシアでは最近大きな問題になっています。こちらですね、カスケード利用がフィットフィップでは求められていないということ、その原因の一つとしてありまして、はい。つまりですね、製材に向かないものをですね、ボードや紙として使い、エネルギー利用は製材工場で発生する残渣や廃棄物などに限定すべきだという、そういう原則なんですけども、それが日本の制度では求められていないということで、例えばですね、国産バイオマスに該当する未利用木質のバイオマス発電所であってもですね、間伐材とか、残渣ではなく、始末材といった、本来でしたらね、家具や建築、などに使えるものがですね、燃料として使われているようなこともですね、散見されます。はい。で、3つ目の課題としましては、この FIT の事業計画策定ガイドラインではですね、輸入木質バイオマス発電の燃料の持続可能性、合法性の証明にですね、森林認証の取得を求めていますが、認証に依存しておるということで、この認証はですね、必ずしも信頼性が高いものではなく、例えば、カナダの事例で見られるように、林業界が作った持続可能な林業イニシアチブが、天然林を切ってもですね、持続可能であるというふうに認証しているように、従来通りの問題のある森林作業ですね、その問題のある森林作業を容認するためにですね、業界団体が自ら作った認証制度というものもですね、あります。で、また、フィットのガイドラインでは、この燃料の持続可能性、合法性の証明方法として、この林野庁の合法木材ガイドラインを参照しているんですけども、ここでは実は森林認証以外の方法も容認されており、業界団体による団体認定、企業独自の取り組み、自己宣言などがあります。これらの方法ではですね、海外の生産地の森林の持続可能性の確認はできません。そのような方法がですね、フィットでは認められています。つまりですね、フィットフィップでは、カスケード利用の原則がなく、またこうしたですね、持続可能性、合法性確認の手順をね、踏みさえすれば、天然林、原生林由来のものであっても、すべての一次木質バイオマスの利用がですね、可能になっています。はい。で、もう一つですね、経済、安定性、電源としての競争力の問題もありまして、近年ですね、先ほど7割が燃料代というふうに言いましたけども、コストであるということで、そもそもですね、補助金がなければですね、こういった輸入木質バイオマス発電所はですね、継続できるものではなく、特に昨今のですね、世界的な木材需給の世界的な逼迫や円安、化石燃料の高騰などによる輸送コストの増大によってですね、燃料代が増加しています。で、輸入バイオマス発電の、電源としての安定性、将来的な自立性はますます下がってきているといった状況です。はい。 で実際にですね、フィット制度の買取期間20年が終了した段階で事業を終了する予定と公言していますし、経産省の方でもですね、自立が難しいと、支援終了後の火力発電へのですね、転換がですね、懸念されています。はい。ということで、少し長くなりましたが、本日のですね、マーティンさんのご発表ではですね、今私がご説明したような、フィット制度の課題といったものをですね、念頭にしておいていただいて、どういったことをですね、この PRI のレポートからですね、学ぶことができるのかとどういったですね、示唆を日本に与えているのかということをですね、考えながら聞いていただければというふうに思います。はい。では私からは以上です。ありがとうございました。
はい、鈴島さんどうもありがとうございました。では、早速ですけれども、続きましてマーティンさんのご発表に移りたいと思います。先ほどはちょっと映像が止まってしまい、音声が途切れてしまいまして大変失礼いたしました。無事戻ってこられてよかったです。では、マーティンさんは、ドイツからですね、ご参加、ドイツからでしたかね。ヨーロッパの方からご参加いただいております。では、改めまして、もう一度、通訳機能について、確認ですけれども、画面下の途中から入られた方はお気になってないかもしれないのですが、画面下の方に地球儀マークがありまして、そこから、通訳機能を選べるようになっています。そこでお聞きになりたい言語を選んでお聞きください。また質問のある方はですね、チャットではなく同じ下に出ております Q&A のところから、ご質問を書いていただければ、このマーティンさんのご発表の後にですね、まとめて、お答えいただける限り、お受けしたいと思います。では、マーティンさん、どうぞよろしくお願いします。
Thank you so much. Can you hear me well? Can you hear me?
はい、よく聞こえます。
Perfect. Thank you so much. Great. Well, it's a pleasure and an honor to be invited again here to present our research and the policy brief that we published in December last year on addressing EU bioenergy policy and investment risks for climate and nature. My name is Martin Stavenhagen. I'm calling you from Berlin. PRI is headquartered in London, but I am calling from Berlin. I am the policy specialist for climate and transition in the EU policy team. And this project on bioenergy started, just to give a little bit of historical context, it started with the Renewable Energy Directive reform, RED3 or RED 3. Over time, looking at the bioenergy contribution of RED 3, gave us some really interesting insights because suddenly realized that in 2021, the renewable energy share of bioenergy is 59% in 2021, and I'll provide some updated numbers later. And because of that, and because we were quite surprised about this, we then looked at the role of bioenergy more generally in renewable energy, in the overall renewable energy strategy in the EU. This work is continuing because the EU has invited a consultation response, invited some feedback on their new bioeconomy strategy, which is expected to be published, or the Commission proposal for this is expected to be published in November this year. So the work continues, starting from bioenergy, looking at wider bioeconomy aspects, and we can talk about that as well. Next slide, please. So the agenda for today would be first, I will provide a little bit of an overview of bioenergy use in the EU, in the European Union. Then second, I want to spend some time on talking about bioenergy risks for EU climate, nature, and bioeconomy objectives. And then also very interesting for this audience will be the investor risks and recommendations, how to deal with identify these risks, what risks are there, and like some preliminary actions to address these risks in bioenergy investments. And I want to end with an overview of bioenergy policies in the EU and some of the recommendations we provided on the future of bioenergy as part of the renewable energy strategy. And then, of course, we'll have time for question and answers. And I'm really interested in any kind of feedback and discussion because I am presenting the EU perspective. And it will be interesting to learn from you how this might apply to the Japanese perspective and the Japanese renewable energy and bioenergy landscape as well, following up from the excellent presentation from my colleague Katsuhiro. So the first part is the bioenergy in the EU, the status quo. So as I mentioned earlier, the starting point was the Renewable Energy Directive. And our research showed with the most current information until late last year that bioenergy contributed 59% of the EU's renewable energy share. Most of it, 3/4, goes into heating and cooling. Bioelectricity is a small part, about 13%, biofuels at 12%. And more than half of all wood harvested in the EU was burned for energy. I currently can't see the screen. Here it is. Perfect. Thank you so much. From late last year and early this year, there's like some new data published on bioenergy, on the renewable energy of and the renewable energy share of bioenergy. And in 2022, bioenergy made up 55% of the renewable energy share. And the most current data I saw was in 2023, it's around half of the renewable energy share. So roughly 50%, but I don't have the concrete data yet. And obviously I'm interested to see what the renewable energy share in 2023 is. Obviously, there's always a time lag of like 2 to 3 years, sometimes even 4 or 5 years on having this data, but it seems to be currently updated. And from everything we can see over the last 2 years, apparently the renewable energy share is going down. This could have to do with the rapid expansion of solar and wind energy overall, but still, if bioenergy provides half of all renewable energy, and the renewable energy share in general is growing, that still means that potentially the overall mass of bioenergy is still growing. I'm not sure about that, while the share is decreasing in the overall expansion of renewable energy. There is a growing biomass supply-demand gap. Even back in 2021, the EU was already using more biomass than can be sourced sustainably. And there's a study that by 2050, demand would be about 40 to 70 or even up to 100% larger than available supply. Here you can see the bioenergy use from 2005 to 2021 with projections to 2050. This data is from the European Scientific Advisory Board for Climate Change, which is an independent scientific body, which was established as part of the EU climate law back in 2021. So they provide independent scientific advice to the European Commissions and European policymakers in the member states and in the Parliament. What can be seen here is that the use of bioenergy has doubled since 2005, and it is expected to double again by 2050. We don't know exactly what the percentage decrease of bioenergy over the last 2 years means, but this is the most current available projection data on the development of bioenergy going forward. This kind of growth from bioenergy from 2005 onwards also coincides with new financial incentives, part of the EU incentive structure for bioenergy. And as you can see for 2030, or as you can see at the 2030 part, that is the benchmark, what was expected the bioenergy to be. But even in 2021, the actual use of bioenergy is already higher than the benchmark for 2030. So in this picture, you can see that it is still more rapidly growing than even was expected for 2030, and then going forward to 2040 and 2050 by the ESA DCC. At this point, I can maybe add that in the annex, you'll find a little bit more of the information on the bioenergy use and the breakup on different things. I won't go into all the details here because I still want to have time for the risks and the policy recommendations, but there's more information in the annex as well. So this is, I would say, the most important slide of my presentation. And I want to explain why bioenergy is not carbon neutral. And there's three main reasons. It has to do with the carbon payback period. It has to do with the emissions intensity, the emissions per energy unit, and it has to do with the role of carbon sinks in the EU. So going through bit by bit, the carbon payback period is determined by the time that a forest needs to regrow after harvest. Forests provide effective storage capacity. Dry wood, half of the weight of dry wood, or half of the mass of dry wood, is actually carbon. And over time, a tree captures a certain amount of this carbon over its lifetime, which is then stored in the wood itself. At the time the tree is actually harvested, all of this captured carbon within the wood is assumed, it's like registered to be lost immediately. And that means this carbon in the accounting is lost no matter what the wood is actually used for, which is an important part to remember. Over time, forest regrowth will balance this carbon emitted from those trees that have been removed. As soon as you have the same amount of tree standing or same amount of forest, it is assumed that this carbon is now carbon neutral. But this means that it takes this time, this carbon payback period, in order to actually make it neutral according to this definition. And this carbon payback period means that this sequestration period, or basically the period that it takes for forest to regrow, can be 60 years, can even be up to 100 years, depending on what trees forested, how old it was, how much carbon it stored. And this time lag creates this carbon debt that will take decades or even up to a century to pay off. And this means that over the next 10 to 20 years, while this carbon payback period has not been paid back yet, emissions from bioenergy and harvest are actually estimated to increase, while actually we have to decrease emissions in the EU, a carbon neutrality target by 2050, net zero by 2050. So bioenergy would actually increase emissions instead of decreasing them by 2050. The second point is that greenhouse gas emissions from wood can be up to 2 or 3 times higher than fossil fuels. Why is that? Because the wood has a lower energy density than coal. Specifically, gas has like a very good, very efficient energy storage capacity. So the power plants that fire wood for heat, power have a lower thermal efficiency than fossil fuels. And that means that CO2 and methane emissions per unit of energy are higher. This is not an argument to burn more fossil fuels. It is just an argument to say that using the same kind of power plant infrastructure and replacing the input from fossil fuels to wood does not increase or does not decrease emissions. It can actually increase emissions even further. And finally, in order for the EU to manage its climate targets, LULUCF, meaning carbon land use change and forestry, LULUCF, is an essential part to reach 2030, 2040, and 2050 targets. So if these carbon sinks, for example, through deforestation or other land use changes, are decreased, then the capacity of nature of these land use to store CO2 from the atmosphere is reduced. At the same time, actually, this capacity has to increase for 2030, and estimates say this land capacity to store carbon has to double for 2040 targets. At the same time, the use of bioenergy kind of risks decreasing carbon sinks while they actually have to increase for the climate targets. Coming now from bioenergy risks for climate to bioenergy risks for nature and social objectives. Deforestation is obviously one of the risks. Over time, EU consumption of, not just for energy, but in general, has caused 10% of global deforestation since 1990. That is a large amount of deforestation that the EU has been responsible for historically. The problem of illegal logging is also significant. One interesting data point here is that 14 to 20% of wood in the EU cannot be traced back to origin. This means both within the EU or outside of the EU. So up to a fifth of the wood that is being used for various purposes, specifically for energy, cannot be certified as having been legally logged or logged from forests that are allowed to be harvested for bioenergy use, and that obviously increases the risks that some of this wood, if not all of this wood, might be illegally logged without being certified or traceable back to its origin. The loss of biodiversity is also an important risk for nature because the area of primary and old growth forests in the EU is less than 4% these days. That means 96% of forests are not primary or old growth forests, but have been more recently planted or grown. And finally, pollution and health impacts in the EU are increasing and cause an estimated 33 billion euros to up to even 114 billion euros of health costs each year. Now, here are the bioenergy risks for nature and economic objectives, meaning specifically the bioeconomy. And here the main thing is the cascading principle. The cascading principle is like the foundation of the circular economy, if you like. And what it means is that you use biomass, any kind of biomass, including wood, for the highest value. And the highest value means that energy retrieval is usually a last resort. The only thing that is less valuable than energy retrieval is actual landfill and end of life. The bioeconomy has a lot of like very, very high value purposes, which now are being explored further. They're already very well known, but they will also influence the new EU bioeconomy strategy. I'm also very interested to see what role biomass actually has for energy, given this new bioeconomy strategy. It's not out yet, so I'm really interested to see what that would be. Some examples are chemicals, medicine, basically not even using the wood, but the biodiversity and the plants, the soils, if you want, the ingredients of the forest for new medicine, for new chemicals, to like explore new materials. And pulp and paper is also very important use of wood, and it can be completely recycled. So that's also like significant. And then finally, construction and wood products, kind of like finding new materials that are less carbon intensive than cement or others, is also a very good and important use of wood. And the final point, the third and final point, is this cascading principles usually always looks at wood as a material, or as, for wood as a material. But it does not integrate the use of biomass as an ecosystem function for, as I mentioned before, for carbon sinks, for biodiversity, for eco-services, for raw materials, and so on, like anything above the raw material part. And because of that, I would say that one has to be careful that this cascading principle is not incomplete, because it does not take into account the value, the services, and the climate objectives of forests even before any harvest. So now I talked a little bit about the bioenergy risks for climate, nature, and social objectives. I would now like to come to the part where you have bioenergy risks for investors. And there's different kinds of risks. I will start with market risks for investors. I think it's no secret that there's an increasing land scarcity problem globally, specifically for food production, also for urbanization, and just a lot of competing uses for land, specifically for soils as well. And in this case, it's interesting to compare energy sources and the land scarcity that they use, specifically renewable energy sources. So solar panels produce 100 times the power per acre or per any kind of land unit as biomass. That's important to know when you consider land as a valuable resource in itself, which you want to use as efficient as possible. And secondly, if you want to provide only 2% of global energy needs from biomass, only 2%, that would already mean doubling total global wood harvests that are already strained these days. I think it's also obvious that there are decreasing costs for renewable alternatives. Wind and solar power are much cheaper than biomass if you measure it as a levelized cost of energy, which is the preferred method. And to be honest, the bioenergy share might already be decreasing in the EU. That does not lower the problems and the risks of biomass use, because we don't know in absolute numbers yet how much biomass is used. And even if it kind of stagnates, it's already beyond regenerative capacity within the EU. But it is possible that these cost and other advantages of wind and power energy as a different kind of renewable energy source are perhaps already in the EU decreasing the share of bioenergy, which in itself is a very interesting and important market signal. I do want to mention that there are niche uses for biomass, bioenergy, for example, for transport, aviation, and maritime, specifically as a transition period where green hydrogen is not available at cost yet as a transition period. And BECCS, or bioenergy capture, carbon capture and storage, basically burning biomass and capturing the carbon, also has like some limited use. But to be honest, I think it will be replaced by direct air carbon capture and storage over time. I think that will be much more efficient to take it directly out of the air and then have that carbon and store it somewhere than using it from biomass, because of the other risks that I talked about before. And also, because primary wood and primary biomass is so valuable, that means in this cascading principle, organic waste streams will become much more valuable, because bio-waste from households, for example, bio-waste in general, like also from agriculture, but also bio-waste from households, if properly recycled, then have this waste for whatever the most valuable purpose is. It could be compost, but it could also be energy as a last retrieval if there's no other use for it, because it's not primary, but it's already went through the value chain. And once it arrives at that stage, it might be the smartest use or the most efficient use to actually use it for energy. These are policy risks for investors in the EU, specifically on the EU, but might be applicable elsewhere as well. The EU climate law from 2021 mandates net zero targets and policy efforts, net zero targets by 2050. And these targets, little bit of background, the target for 2030 is already in the EU climate law. It means reducing emissions by 55% across the EU by 2030. Current emission reductions are at roughly 37%. So there's still a lot to do until 2030. The EU 2040 climate target is currently being discussed. It's under discussion and is rumored to be around 90%, probably 85 to 90%, but a lot of people, including PRI, are pushing for at least 90%. We also have a policy brief on that. And then 90% by, let's say, 85 to 90% by 2040 would then be a net zero target for 2050. But as I mentioned before, all of these targets rely on biomass and land use for carbon sinks. So you need that land use for carbon sinks. And that then is a real policy risks on the further use of bioenergy, given various policy needs for this forestry. It also shows already in less public support and financial incentives for bioenergy. The Renewable Energy Directive has some limitations, or quite a few limitations, on how biomass can be used for bioenergy. There are different EU member states, for example, the Netherlands, that are removing subsidies for biomass for energy altogether. And this also means lower return of investment because once you exclude tax incentives, subsidies, or other financial incentives, the profitability of using biomass actually goes down significantly. And it doesn't compete with other renewable energy sources, as I mentioned before. And also interesting are increasing legal risks. There are court cases against, for example, inclusion of forestry and biomass activities into the EU taxonomy, meaning a court case against labeling forestry and biomass as a sustainable activity in the EU taxonomy. There are court cases against illegal logging in Estonia. Again, it's more than just one country. I'm just taking this as an example, but it's definitely court cases against EU countries and illegal logging there, because forestry has decreased a lot in parts of in various parts, including Scandinavia as well. And the UK biomass strategy has included biomass energy capture and storage, BECCS, as a negative emissions technology. There's a court case against that because biomass use for energy does not remove carbon from the atmosphere. On the contrary, you could say it adds, but at the very, very most, over like a period of 60 to 100 years, you could call it neutral, but it can't be negative because it doesn't store more carbon than it emits over time. So there's a court case against that for, greenwashing reasons in the UK strategy. This might also be very interesting specifically for financial market actors. The disclosure, transition, and reputational risk for investors. You might be aware of the Science Based Targets Initiative, SBTI, and it specifies, I'll just quote here, quote, CO2 emissions from the combustion, processing, and distribution phase of bioenergy, as well as the land-based emissions and removals associated with bioenergy feedstocks, meaning bioenergy storage over time, shall be reported alongside a company's greenhouse gas inventory. This means the entire value chain, or how should I say, emissions chain, the entire emissions chain of bioenergy from the, that is just before the actual harvest of bioenergy, but more importantly, after the harvest of bioenergy, the emissions that come from that, and the emissions that cannot be captured in the future because of removal of forestry, which prevents further carbon storage from those specific trees. All of that has to be included. And I quote again, must be included when setting a science-based target for scopes 1, 2, and or 3 as required, and when reporting progress against that target. So these scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions from using biomass for energy, according to SBTi standards, have to all be included, which means that these are much higher greenhouse gas emissions in portfolios from biomass, even than fossil fuels could be. And there are certain related risks for disclosure and transition plans, depending on the targets for decarbonization in the investment strategy and in the investment portfolio. And part of this disclosure is the reputational risk related to deforestation, loss of biodiversity by importing wood from old forests. There's like lots of cases where wood has been imported from old primary high biodiversity ancient forests from the US and Canada, for example, but also other parts, Russia as well. Again, I don't want to single out specific countries, but it's a lot of them where EU imports have actually deforested primary old growth forests that should definitely not be included also by law in biomass. And I remind you of the 14 to 20% undeclared or unclear, non-traceable wood, which might easily be these like old primary growth forests. Illegal logging, I already mentioned, for energy, wood products, furniture manufacturers, and also health and pollution impacts from bioenergy with local protests and media reports from India, Ireland, UK, but many other countries as well. And finally, we have the investor recommendations, how to address these risks. This means that investors with bioenergy or biomass in their portfolio can mitigate these risks through stewardship activities and engaging with utilities, forestry sector, and relevant investee companies. There's three things that can be done. One is to quantify and minimize full life cycle greenhouse gas emissions for utilities, which means to disclose the greenhouse gas intensity, usually measured as kilogram of CO2 per megawatt hour within the operations. But on top of that, on top of operations, you also need to include loss of long-term forest carbon storage, processing, transportation, and completions. This is what I already covered in the SBTi example earlier. The second thing is obviously it will be important to have audited supply chains and then to exclude suppliers with unsustainable harvesting practices. And unsustainable harvesting practices can be identified through, at the very least, these four examples. There should not be any harvest only for bioenergy. I mean, obviously there will be wood harvest, but if it's only for bioenergy, that is not sustainable. There should be no harvest from high biodiversity natural forests, meaning these old primary growth forests that we talked about. There should also not be any conversion of natural ecosystems, natural old primary forests, into managed or plantation forests. That is also considered unsustainable because it reduces biodiversity, it reduces it even reduces the carbon storage because usually old forests capture more storage than younger ones. And there should be no clear cutting whatsoever. So you have to make sure that you don't cut the entire forest, but like manage different areas over time. And finally, it's also recommended to maximize harvest use for long-lived wood products. So what this means in simple terms is only secondary forestry residues and no living trees should be used for biomass to reduce these risks. And obviously organic waste streams are also like a very good opportunity for energy reuse and energy retrieval if there's no other valuable purpose for them. These are all ways to minimize risks for investors of the use of biomass for energy in their own portfolio. So I now come to the final part of my presentation, but also one of the most interesting parts because it has to do with the policy aspect of this. What are the policy risks and what are the policy recommendations? I understand this is a very full slide. I will not go through everything, But at the same time, I just wanted to show how much these different policies are all interrelated. We started with the Renewable Energy Directive, and you can see it's the second point. At the time, in that reform, the renewable energy share target was 42.5%. I think by now we're at 23 or 24% of all energy is now renewable. But the target for 2030 is that 42.5% of all energy should be from renewable sources. And then also this the Renewable Energy Directive, it didn't remove all incentives for bioenergy, but it did very much curtain them, narrow them down. Sustainability criteria were made stronger. No direct financial support is allowed. Indirect financial support is allowed, but not direct financial support. And there's certain kind of, I mean, I write loopholes here, but there's certain kind of exclusions, let's say. For example, the energy efficiency of power plants that use biomass has been increased significantly, the efficiency criteria. But that doesn't mean it is completely excluded from being able to burn wood for energy either. And you can see, I mean, on top is the EU climate law and the Fit for 55 package. Fit for 55 package means a policy package that was created to reach the 2030 target of reducing emissions by 55%. In the EU climate law, it says all policies need to be aligned with this target. And that means the LULUCF regulation that mandates carbon sink targets for carbon storage from member states, the deforestation regulation, which is currently it has been postponed, it might be postponed again. There's certain kind of negotiations and also some pushback against it because it would very much increase the traceability and be like a very significant measure against deforestation, even outside of the EU. But there's certain kind of interest groups and certain kind of different opinions on this, which means it is still being negotiated, although it should have applied from this year already. Yeah, and then even national energy and climate plans in the EU also should have requirements to report on biomass use. They have requirements on reporting on what impacts this biomass use has on carbon sinks and carbon sink targets in the EU. But the reporting and data has been criticized for not being sufficient in linking, first of all, in properly disclosing on a national level how much biomass is used for energy. And secondly, just as important, if not more important, to make the link on what impact does this have on national carbon sinks. I have some others here, the nature restoration law, the forest monitoring law, the EU taxonomy. All of these policies are also connected to biomass use and also bioenergy use. And here is an overview of the policy recommendations. This is the last part of the presentation, but I want to go through each part bit by bit, so I can go into more detail on what these three parts mean. However, I mean, just as an overview, the three overall recommendations are: one, a shift from biomass for energy to nature-based solutions; two, to provide consistent price signals for emissions from bioenergy; and three, to create a coherent governance framework for biomass use, specifically relevant given the new bioeconomy strategy in the EU, and lots of like interesting considerations on what biomass use for the future should look like, both as a material or for these other purposes, as well as for nature restoration, climate, social purposes as well. So here we have the first part, which is to shift from biomass for energy to nature-based solutions. Two main recommendations. One is to provide a cap on biomass for energy in the Renewable Energy Directive. So basically, this means that one of the recommendations PRI has in the report is to restrict the volume of woody biomass that can count towards renewable energy targets, that can count towards this renewable energy target of 42.5% in the Renewable Energy Directive. That means, yes, what is important for that is also to specify a science-based definition of primary biomass in the Renewable Energy Directive. There are really good science-based definitions from the EU itself, but they are not reflected in the Renewable Energy Directive, which is obviously really important to connect specifically what primary biomass is and what part of it has to be excluded according to RED 3 regulations. And we talked about this, the biogenic wastes and residues, bio-waste, should be prioritized for energy in comparison to primary wood and living forests, let's say. Anything that has already cascaded down the value chain is preferable for lower uses, including energy retrieval, i.e. bio-waste. The second thing is how to prioritize biomass for carbon sinks and LULUCF objectives. It's the carbon sink discussion we had. It's really important to utilize the carbon storage potential of biomass, living biomass, forests, peatlands, other natural habitats to fulfill the requirements for the 2030 climate targets, to contribute according to plan to the reduction of emissions by 55%. This also means that there should be additional revenue streams for forest industries and owners to compensate for the financial incentives of material use. There is a regulation, forest monitoring framework regulation in the EU, which should be adopted. Currently, it doesn't look like that, but that would provide a lot of relevant data on the health of forests, on their use across the EU. And this kind of data transparency, this kind of information will definitely help to provide, the necessary underlying baseline for better policy development for biomass and forestry use. And this is directly related to stronger monitoring, reporting, and verification for forest biomass use. I'm talking about national states here, member states, for example, through the forest monitoring framework. It applies the same thing to companies or investors as well. Monitoring, reporting, and verification, what biomass from which forests is used and how sustainable it was harvested and what the sustainability criteria are from its origin need to be stronger. This is the second of the 3 points. It's important to provide consistent price signals for emissions from bioenergy, which means first, to remove financial support and incentives for primary biomass for energy. Primary is the most important word here. The recommendation is to end all subsidies and other incentives for burning primary woody biomass for power or heating, and also to shift subsidies and financial incentives to alternative fossil fuel substitutions. What I mean is fossil fuel substitutions that are not biomass, for example, wind, solar energy, and so on. It has to be said that the Renewable Energy Directive really takes some important steps towards that objective, but it also falls short in other parts. So the direction of travel is correct. The speed of travel and the implementation is not adequate given all the different uses for biomass. And what is also really important in this discussion is to harmonize the data collection, the monitoring, and the way greenhouse gases are counted for biomass for energy. So without going into all the details, we talked a little bit about how carbon accounting methodologies could be improved. They could include emissions from burning biomass in energy sustainability criteria of EU legislation that is related to climate. The emission impacts of biomass use are not adequately reflected in EU legislation, and thus also in climate objectives going forward. And that means also that the renewable energy share of different sources should be calculated using comparable methodologies. This is a little bit nerdy, but kind of electricity-based renewable energy is accounted for differently than biomass energy use, because bioenergy use is accounted towards the bioenergy potential within it, while my colleague Katsuro already mentioned the low energy efficiency of this bioenergy potential, while with electricity, you look directly at the electricity output or the energy output. These are different methodologies, so it's not easy, but you have to make sure that you compare apples to apples and not have different kind of comparisons that might favor biomass, but are not accurate in the larger picture. This is the third overall recommendations to create a coherent governance framework for biomass. I think these recommendations can become more specific given looking at the bioenergy strategy, which again, I'm already saying it, but I'm quite excited about it. But these are overall principles that will also apply. And also PRI participated in the consultation, and we provided a consultation response, what we consider priorities for the bioeconomy strategy, and that is also on our website. So the two things I just want to point out here are to apply the cascading principles to ensure high value biomass use. This means to make the cascading principle in RED 3 mandatory. Currently it's a principle, but it would be great to have this cascading principle as mandatory to prioritize biomass for high value and low quantity use in the bioeconomy as efficient as possible, use it for the highest value and at the lowest quantity in the bioeconomy, which except for some exceptions, usually this will not be bioenergy use, but more the higher value bioeconomy use. Secondly, the second part here is to exclude the use of primary woody biomass for energy from sustainable economic activities in the EU taxonomy. There's so many discussions going on. It has to do with the fact on, according to sustainable activities in the EU taxonomy, should biomass for energy be considered sustainable and be integrated, or should it not? And for various reasons, which I mentioned, it should be excluded from the EU taxonomy as not sustainable. And and the cascading principle can also be improved by including the in situ benefits of living non-harvested biomass. And these NECPs, it's the abbreviation for National Energy and Climate Plans. These are mandatory for each member state according to the EU Energy and Climate Governance Regulation. Every member state has to provide this NECP and update it regularly. And here, again, as part of the monitoring and reporting and verification, the bioenergy use in this NECP, in the national strategy, has to be harmonized and aligned with the LULUCF objectives, the carbon sink objectives, right? So it's really important to have the data and the transparency necessary to ensure this, which means these NECPs need to provide comprehensive and reliable data on the supply and the use of biomass for energy and the impact on the LULUCF sink. NECPs have to improve the information data transparency on this. And also affected stakeholders, which is the local population, which are forest owners, which is the industry, which might be local municipalities as well. All of these should be integrated or should be included in long-term integrated planning and environmental sensitivity mapping, looking at the impacts of forest use, of biomass use more generally as well, into this local community and the larger economy and the larger national strategy, including municipalities as well. this is a summary of these priorities, these policy recommendations. On the left-hand side, you see the recommendations, the way they are formulated. I'll just repeat. 1, to shift from biomass for energy to nature-based solutions. 2, to provide consistent price signals for emissions from bioenergy. And 3, to create a coherent governance framework for biomass. So these conclusions in more simple language are: 1, wood is a scarce, really valuable material. It should not be burned, specifically primary wood should not be burned as long as other uses remain, according to the cascading principle and the highest value use over time. Yeah, so do not burn wood as long as other more valuable uses remain. Second, use living biomass to enhance nature, biodiversity, to store carbon, climate objectives, and to decarbonize the material economy in that order. So nature, climate, bioeconomy strategy. And finally, shift the policy framework from a biomass for energy principle or approach to living biomass for climate and nature, which would mean just to expand the horizon on what the most valuable use is for bioenergy, not just from an economic perspective, but also from the policy objectives that you have yourself, which will include nature and climate objective as well, which is the title of this presentation. This is just the next steps on how to stay engaged. There is an EU climate policy group on our collaboration platform. I will be very happy to provide the link. Actually, there's 2 groups. There's one on the climate strategy in the EU, but there's also one specifically on the bioenergy use. So if you're interested in this, then you're very much invited to join this collaboration platform group and be kept updated on developments. I was talking about the bioeconomy. That would be a very interesting development that we will keep you updated on. There's additional resources, and you can also sign up to the monthly PRI policy newsletter if you haven't done so. And here's also my email if you have any further questions. And with that, I would very much like to thank you for your attention, and I'm open for any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
はい、マーティンさんどうもありがとうございました。大変ですね。示唆に富むご発表でした。日本においても、ご存知の通り、フィットバイオマス発電ということでですね、日本では、電気だけを対象にした、賦課金、補助制度が、ありまして、先ほどの提言でお話しされていたようなですね、例えば、バイオマス燃料のために伐採はしない、エネルギー利用のための伐採はしないですとか、天然林の伐採、生物多様性豊かな天林の伐採を、して燃料にしてはいけないですとか、天然林から、その植林への転換を、促進するようなことがあってはならないですが、そういったことはですね、日本のフィット制度では、一つも求められていないという状況になっております。なので、非常にこういった今回のポリシーレポートから私たちは学ぶべきところが非常に多いかなと思っています。いくつか質問をすでにいただいておりますので、私の方で読み上げていきたいと思います。まず最初に、この EU バイオエネルギーの政策レポートはどのような背景、どうぞ。
I'm so sorry. I don't know exactly
ごめんなさい。それは、今のマーティンさんからですね。すいません。どうぞ。
Thank you so much. I'm not absolutely sure what the translation is. I just want to make sure that I was talking about prohibiting primary old growth forests for any kind of forest harvesting, not any kind of natural forest per se, just to make sure that the translation accurately reflects that. Thank you.
は はい、ありがとうございます。そうですね。ちょっと私たちも原生林と天然林という言葉の使い方はいつも、悩むところです。日本では原生林というと、かなりもう本当の老齢林に近いものを指すことが多いので、カナダの原生林の定義などとはかなりずれているという現状がありま
Yeah.
す。はい。では、ありがとうございます。では、質問の方に行きたいと思います。EU のバイオエネルギーの政策レポートはどのような背景、動機で作成されたのでしょうか。EU の機関投資家も EU のバイオエネルギー政策の現状について、このレポートで示されたようなリスクを認識しているのでしょうかというご質問です。
The main reason was this developed from recommendations that we had for in the EU policy team, I'm responsible for climate and transition policies. The Renewable Energy Directive, the RED III, the third revision, is essential to climate policy. And when we then learned that at the time 59% and still probably more than 50% of renewable energy is from biomass, that became a really, really important topic for policy recommendations. Because of that, obviously we included investor risks, policy risks for climate and nature, obviously, and then investor risks as well, and then came up with some investor recommendations as well. I would say that the awareness of these bioenergy risks among all kinds of investors is not that high yet, and that's why this report is published in order to raise the awareness, help our signatories to better identify risks that are related to bioenergy. It's more than just raising awareness. It's actually, helping to inform well-informed investment strategies and looking at the risks and the specific uses or less useful resources of biomass for energy in your portfolio. And there's still, I think, a lot of information to be shared. I was shocked when I heard the 59% or the more than 50%, because obviously renewable energy has to be supported for an important climate strategy. It's really important to look at what kind of renewable energy is more useful for climate and nature and investment objectives.
はい、ありがとうございます。今回のセミナーに先立ってですね、実は7月には、この PRI の、今回もPRI の方にご協力いただいてるんですけれども、PRI の方に向けた、日本の投資家、責任投資に、原則に関わる方々に向けたセミナーというのことで、マーティンさんに実は一度お話しいただいております。はい、じゃあ次の質問に行きたいと思います。ですね。マーティンさんへの質問ですけれども、EUDR と、今回のウェビナーで、報告された、政策提言の間にどのような、関係があるでしょうかというご質問です。
That's an excellent question. The EUDR, the EU Deforestation Regulation, for those who don't know, it targets 7 commodities and related products to these commodities that have been associated with high risks of deforestation in countries outside of the EU. And it requires higher traceability standards and this kind of improving the identification of the origin of where these commodities come from, and also through geolocation data to see if deforestation has taken place at these areas, at these countries and areas where these commodities come from. Rubber, cattle, certain kind of agricultural products, and so on. Now, it's hotly contested in the EU. It would be a very big step forwards to address the root causes of deforestation. At the same time, it also puts certain kind of requirements on producers, on producing countries, on companies that import, and due diligence requirements. It is very much related to the use of biomass, any kind of use of biomass, not just for energy. And I think it's such a significant, I think it's unique in that something like this hasn't been applied before. And because of that, there's lots of questions on how to best implement it. And in the EU, it has been postponed by a year already. And now it is expected to be postponed another year, although it is already done and adopted, doesn't mean it couldn't be reopened. We're all waiting to see what happens with it. I just want to mention that there is support for this EUDR from big agricultural, agricultural companies, Nestle, chocolate producers, some coffee producers as well. So some are in favor of it and some are less in favor of it. But it's important for deforestation, obviously.
はい、ありがとうございます。では次の質問です。基本的にご発表の内容に賛成です。ただ、森林残差の利用については補助金を出してもいいのではないでしょうか。ご意見をお願いします。
That's a good question. I don't have a strong opinion on that. Let me put it this way. There might be different uses for a subsidy, for organic waste, or sorry, for residues or organic waste, whatever. For example, for furniture, let's say. It would be interesting to know what the highest value use is, and subsidies sometimes distort the picture of what the highest value use is. So if there is a really good high value use that could be supported through subsidies, that might be a really good idea. If the subsidies redirect residues or organic waste or whatever the output is into a less sustainable, more importantly, not less sustainable, less valuable use, if it redirects and shifts the actual incentive on using it for the highest value use, then obviously it's a market distortion and might not be the smartest policy choice. So short answer, I'm not against subsidies, but you have to be careful that it doesn't distort the cascading principle. I hope that makes sense. If there's any further questions on this, I'll be happy to take them because it's a really good question and it's some of the intricacies of policies where you just have to be careful to see what the impact is and if the impact of what you're doing follows the objectives you have.
はい、ありがとうございます。次も別の方からですけれども、関連する質問です。日本における木質バイオマス利用の議論では、カスケード利用という用語は、伐採した木材を一切廃棄せず、完全に活用することを、意味するとされることが多いです。伐採した一次木材の一部を直接燃料として利用することもカスケード利用の一環であると、頻繁に述べられています。このカスケード利用の解釈は PRI や EU の観点からは、誤りとみなされるのでしょうか。
I really have to be careful here because I cannot comment on Japan policy. I don't have enough information on that. I can comment on my understanding of the cascading principle and also like the EU understanding of the cascading principle to some degree. And following up on what I said earlier, the cascading principle means to use it at the highest value before going down to other values. Now, if you decide to harvest primary wood for any use, then you have to make sure that the use is of highest value. And it's very unlikely that there are no higher value uses than energy retrieval. If you look at the slide on the cascading principle, if you check and see that these other uses from wooden products to, chemicals, material uses, pulp and paper, whatever it is, if all of these don't apply, then of course, according to cascading principle, energy retrieval is the highest value use. But it's likely that there will be other uses. And it's also not unlikely that subsidies might shift the incentive towards specific uses over other high value uses. So I think it's an excellent question. And I think the graphic really helps him to identify if the cascading principle has been followed or not. That doesn't mean that every jurisdiction will define it the same way. But I think from a scientific point of view, highest value use is highest value use. Just look at what the market offers for different uses.
はい、ありがとうございます。はい、ちょっと今はですね、いろんな科学技術の進展で木材利用についても、昔とはまた違ったような、利用の仕方、セルロースナノファイバーとか、そういった新しい利用方法も生まれてきてますので、そういったことも、今まで残差だったものが、実は違う利用用途が生まれてくるということもあり得るのかなと思います。そうすると、カスケード利用というのは、またより一層大事になってくるのではないかなと思いました。はい、じゃあ次の質問に行きます。森林
Can I
認
add
証、
one more
ど
comment
う
to
ぞ。
that? I want to mention that the cascading principle starts at material use. And in my slide, I also mentioned that there are other potentially higher value uses that have to do with living biomass. These are usually not included in the cascading principle, but that's why I would argue that you need a more holistic view of policy objectives, which includes, for example, biodiversity objectives, which very much includes climate objectives. Climate objectives are much more easily measurable than nature objectives. That's why climate is easier to integrate into policy than nature. Both are really important, obviously. But if you have carbon sink objectives that you need land use for, and specifically forestry, then that might not be reflected in the cascading principle. I'm really interested to see how the bioeconomy in the EU handles that. I have a feeling that the bioeconomy starts at the economic material use and doesn't include the other uses. But I think for a really holistic and really a political strategy, a policy strategy on how to make the best use, the best national use of your own really useful bio resources, which are to some degree the wealth of each country, right? Has to include all policy objectives, and bioeconomy is a really important one, but it's only one of various objectives.
はい、ありがとうございます。まさにその点が、このレポートを読んで非常に私たちが感銘を受けた点の一つでした。その生きている森林の価値、生態系や生態系サービスの価値から、そのカスケードの、階段を数え始めると、カウント始めるということが非常に難しいんですけれども、いわば、本来であればそれが当たり前であってほしいというかですね、森林の価値をきちんと認識していないと、もう木材と炭素の価値しかなくなってしまうような、そういう考え方になってしまうと、すごく大きな過ちを、してしまうのではないかなということが、大きな懸念で、このレポートをご紹介したいと思いました。はい。では、次の質問に行きたいと思います。森林認証制度について、どれが優れているか、どれが望ましくないかといった評価を行っている情報ソースがあれば教えてください。バイオマス発電を行っている企業と対話すると、認証を受けているので問題ないという回答になってしまいます。バイオマスのサプライチェーンについてより深く企業と対話するにはどうすればよいかを考えています。何かヒントをいただけると幸いです。
I think you start, very, very good question. I think you start with the general principles that are on the recommendation slide. I think the first step is always to create transparency. So, like any kind of companies that you're invested in should be able to answer those questions just for due diligence. Ideally, they might be verified by an independent third-party auditor. I'm not an expert on that, but I would say that if those questions are answered, what is the greenhouse gas intensity and the emissions impact across the entire value chain? Are you using these harvesting practices that might be considered unsustainable? And as a bonus, that already goes to the next step, but to look at what the wood is harvested for, actually, that's also important. For transparency reasons, you can make your own decisions, but it's good to know what this wood is harvested for. You can like see if some uses might be productive than others, to be honest, also more valuable. If you answer those questions, then I think you have a much better picture to see how you want to decide to go forward. And if you have your own climate objectives in your portfolio, then that information will also help you to how to calculate if this bioenergy investment supports these climate targets you have or not. There's like very good calculations for that. You just have to have the right information and know how to calculate it. But before any kind of calculation, the information is the first part. So a company that you invest in for your own risk management has to be able to provide the information that you need to make good decisions. That's always the first step. That's what I would recommend.
はい、ありがとうございます。認証についてはですね、様々な認証があって、確かに、見極めるのがなかなか難しいんですけれども、今月の終わりぐらいに、まだ日程決まってませんが、SBP というサステナブルバイオマスプログラムという、認証をテーマにした、ウェビナーをまた開催する予定にしておりますし、私たちが、最近公表しましたバイオマス発電インフォというウェブサイトの方でもそういった情報を出していきたいと思っていますので、ぜひご注目ください。すいません。あとですね、1分ほどになってしまったんですけれども、あと2問、ごめんなさい。あと2問、3問いただいてますので、お時間ある方はぜひお付き合いください。マーティンさん、あと少しだけお願いしたいです。ですね、EUDR がさらに1年延期するというのは緩和の動きに見えますが、実際に発動した時の効力は確かなものとなるのでしょうかというご質問ですが。
Short answer, we don't know yet. Any kind of implementation will be helpful. There's one big risk. There's the potential integration of a no-risk category. A no-risk category doesn't make scientific sense because you already have a low-risk category, and they're always all low risks. But to say a country has no risk of deforestation is scientifically not correct. So will it have teeth? We don't know yet. Will it be implemented? Even that, hopefully, because it has already been adopted, and it's very much a discussion progress. What I do know is that we'll know by the end of this year, because according to current standards, it has to be implemented by 31st of December or 1st of January from next year. And there has to be a decision before that. And as soon as we know that, we'll know what the next steps are.
はい、ありがとうございます。先ほどの残差の質問の続きですね。残差を利用しないで、森林残差を利用しないで放置した場合、分解して最終的には水と炭酸ガスを放出し、地球への負荷となります。これを有効利用するという意味では、森林残差の熱利用に補助金を出す意味があると考えます。ご意見をお願いします。
It's an excellent question. The residue picture is more complicated than that, because if you leave the residues in the forest, a large part of that will actually sip into the soil and actually be captured. So leaving in the forest in general actually produces less emissions than taking it out. Again, depending on what you use it for, right? If you use it for, I don't know, compost or whatever low carbon use you can think of, that might be a similar picture. Usually combustion will release all of the carbon in the residues, while leaving in the forest does not emit all carbon in the residues. On the contrary, it actually makes the soil richer over time. On subsidies, I think we already discussed that. Subsidies make sense if there is no other higher value use. And you have to be really careful to look at what the higher value uses are to see if subsidies make sense or distort really important market incentives. That's what I would think. Just like transparency is really useful. And before you apply subsidies, just make sure you have transparency and then see how you might want to incentivize one use over the other. I think that would be a very, diligent approach, very smart policy approach.
はい、ありがとうございます。では、最後の質問です。このレポートの内容が EU によって広く受け入れられた場合、EU におけるバイオマス発電の多くが座礁資産化する可能性があるのではと思います。どのように考えたらよいでしょうか。
It's interesting, right? The question of stranded assets is an important one, given, climate policy objectives. I don't have a perfect answer for that. I can say that a preliminary answer to what to do with these like power plants, the old power plants, was to make them more sustainable by replacing fossil fuels with biomass. What we see now is that that does not necessarily make them more sustainable, meaning that does not necessarily add to their value for climate objectives, and also creates other problems as well. To say, I do not know what this means for stranded assets for power plants. I'm not a technical expert to know what you could do with them. I do think that your question really raises the important issue of pointing out the risks that they become stranded assets, and that has to be dealt with in one way or another.
はい、どうもありがとうございました。ではですね、長い時間、そして時間を少し超過して、お話しいただき、聞いていただいている方にも申し訳ありませんでした。マーティさん、どうもありがとうございました。皆さん、拍手をお願いします。はい。ではですね、これからも、私たちも
Thank you very
様
much.
々な、このバイオマス発電の問題、バイオマスエネルギーの問題について、勉強を続けてですね、より良いその森林利用や管理、より良いその気候変動対策について、一緒に考え続けていければなと思っています。マーティンさんにもまたいろいろ教えていただきたいと思います。マーティンさんの書かれたレポートはですね、日本語訳がすでに私たちのサイトの方に、公開されておりますので、また、機会ありましたらそちらもご覧ください。では、これにて、本日の、セミナーを終了したいと思います。チャットの方にありますけれども、退出後には、アンケートもございますので、ぜひぜひご記入のほどお願いします。では、マンティさん、本当に今日はありがとうございました。
Thank you from my side. It's been a pleasure, and thanks for the appreciation. Thank you very much.